Seek the shalom of the city. Seek the shalom of the city where you've been sent. For in the shalom of that place where you've been sent to exile, you will find your shalom. I am so glad that I can come here with all you evangelicals. Isn't that great? That this is a place where the evangelicals come. Donald, your brow is furrowed. Evangelical, Greek, good news. It's a place where people come to hear good news. Really good news. Enough good news that it might be newsworthy. So what is the good news of this passage? It kind of sounds really Florence-esque, doesn't it? Wherever you are, plant gardens, get married, have kids, have grandkids, and seek the well-being, seek the common good wherever you are. Because when we seek the common good, when we seek shalom, it's not just good for others. It's good for us. It's good for the planet. Sounds like good news. Well, the first hearers didn't hear it that way. So, a little background. Do you remember last week when we had the psalm that people prayed as exiles? Psalm 137. The same group of people who prayed this way, "By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion." Marching to Zion, beautiful. No, we're not marching to Zion. As for our musical instruments, we hung them up on the willows that grow in that land. For there our captors asked for a song, our tormentors called for mirth and joy. Sing us a song of Zion. But how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy, if I do not pray for the peace of Jerusalem. So here we have a minor prophet, minor in this sense. He didn't make the cut. He wasn't important enough to get deported. And if you look in verses 2 and 3 and 4, it lists all the important people, all the ranking officials, priests, kings, princes, prophets. Oh, but Jeremiah didn't make it. He was young and he was from the wrong part of the country. And his prophecies didn't agree with other people's prophecies. So the prophets in Jerusalem were in tune with this psalm saying, this is horrible. The whole plan for God's common good has been crushed. Because what is the plan? Well, we've been called, like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, to come apart from people, to have our own land, to have our own city, to have our own king, to have our own temple, our own God, so that all the people in the world will know God's shalom. But when the king and the military found themselves playing out the agenda of all the surrounding nations and empires, wheeling and dealing, fighting and defending, paying tribute, the end result, which the prophets predicted, was Jerusalem fell. It was a horrible fall. It was a terrible siege of starvation. And the city came down. The temple and all its finery came down, and the goods were hauled away. The city walls came down. And Nebuchadnezzar, in his wisdom, said, well, since this is part of my territory, I'll leave some poor people here, people who are willing to plant gardens and tend the olive trees and the vineyards and, these prophets that nobody cares about. I'll leave that. So, you have the people, God's people, in Babylon, weeping and mourning and thinking about the good old days when Jerusalem was great. We could be great again. We're going back. Surely God is going to send us back. And we heard in our psalm today, we remember God let the people go through the Red Sea. That's our God. God does stuff like that. And we have to keep doing the Jerusalem project. We have to keep building walls and temples and powers and kings. Because that's how the people will know that God is God. And so the prophets are saying, yes, indeed, it'll be soon. You'll be going back. That was the word that was out. Mourn, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Keep yourselves together, because soon the people of God will be restored and will go back to Jerusalem. That was good news for a horrible situation. I would have liked that news. That sounds really like good news. But it wasn't, because it wasn't the truth. Jeremiah, by his prophetic connection to God, had a different picture. He said, oh, no, this is a very big thing. And yes, God is the sovereign of history. God does not abandon God's people. But be ready for generations. We're talking generations. At least 3 generations. Like about 70 years, which proved to be the case. So what do you do for 70 years? Do you make yourselves a little enclave? Do you refuse to learn the local language? Do you just make little jobs among yourself and have worship that nobody else is allowed into? This is the good news. What was it? So this letter comes all the way from Jerusalem, and it says, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives, and I couldn't find out for sure, but I'm assuming that means Babylonian wives. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there. Do not decrease. Because we remember back to Genesis 1, what are we supposed to do? Be fruitful and multiply. Well, that applies, even in exile. But seek the welfare. The Hebrew is Shalom. We don't have any one word that's like it. Flourishing, prosperity, peace and justice, healing and hope. The common good is the phrase I'm using this fall. The common good for everyone and everything. Seek the shalom of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its shalom you will find your shalom. And indeed, what we know of the exiles is that their whole identity, their sense of God, their sense of what it means to God's people, to be God's people in the world, was transformed. The kind of transformation of consciousness that does not take place easily or quickly. And the final editions of Genesis and many of the Psalms come out of that cross-cultural existence. That awareness is there are other gods. There are other stories of creation. What's ours? How do we say ours? What do we really want to say about who we are and who we believe God to be? So when the exiles returned, they returned with longing for the Messiah of Shalom. Now, of course, there are always competing visions. So the vision of restoring the dynasty did not die quickly. And when Jesus appeared, many people said, "Here he is, the king! The king's back! Now we can have the good old days again." But what did Jesus do? He sought the shalom of wherever and whomever he encountered. His vision was much bigger about what really makes for shalom. In the story of the 10 lepers, the one who came back was a foreigner, was a hated foreigner, was a Samaritan. That's the one who came back. And Jesus said, "Look, weren't there 10? And one comes back? A Samaritan?" And he essentially is saying, see the common good in this Samaritan? See how this Samaritan connects the dots? See how this Samaritan has to express gratitude to God? Would be, he didn't say this, but this is what I hear. If we only were all like the Samaritan, and we have other Samaritan examples, if we were only good Samaritans, then we would have common good. So thank God we're all in evangelicals here today, and that we want to live by this good news. I am using the book Public Faith in Action, How to Think Carefully, Engage Wisely, and Vote with Integrity, recently released by Miroslav Volf, who is a Croatian exile, American citizen, and theologian. And he says, if we want to know what the common good is, we have to look beyond the news cycle. We have to look beyond common decency to the big picture of what God is trying to accomplish, to the shalom of the common good of the planet. And he has a chapter on each of many things that he says, in his opinion, it's not that hard for Christians to figure out where we stand about wealth, number one. Number two, the environment, education, work and rest, poverty, borrowing, lending, marriage and family, new life, health, on and on. Interesting that he lists number two as the environment. Are you hearing that in the political conversation? Did you know what the biggest good news for millennia was this week? What was it? What is the good news that is being blotted out by the Paris Accord? The Paris Accord for climate change. The commitment of now 75 nations to say we will live, starting November the 4th, by this agreement we hammered out to change the future of this planet. Now, good news always speaks back to bad news. And the bad news was that on September the 30th, the people in Hawaii who check the state of our environment said, September's supposed to be a lower month, but we have 400 particles per million of carbon in our atmosphere in September of 2016. And respected scientists are saying, we haven't seen that number for millions of years. And that's not a number that goes away overnight. So the bad news is very real. And the good news is there if we look for it. And our part of living into that good news is there if we look for it. You remember several years ago, I was so excited about the transition movement, which says from oil dependency to local resilience. And I think Bill McKibben would love this chapter of Jeremiah, because he's saying, Bill McKibben and other environmentalists are saying, Rob Hopkins of Transition, the way the new world is coming is on your doorstep. If we are going to learn to live a different way without all the gas and oil and coal upon which we depend, it starts with your house, it starts with my house, it starts with my neighbors, it starts with the local fuel company and the local elected officials. It starts with somebody reminding me, Nina, didn't you say you're going to hang your laundry outside? You caved. You're back to the dryer. Such little things come out of a vision of shalom, a big picture vision of shalom that believes that love prevails, that believes that peace prevails, that believes that joy prevails. Boy, I'm so glad we're evangelicals here, because it's not easy to believe those things some days. But the choice to despair and become cynical is not an option for me. And it wasn't an option for Jesus. Miroslav Volf writes, Christ does not merely lead life well as an example for others, but actually draws human beings into the goodness of his life and empowers them to flourish. Not just an historic figure, not only an exemplar and a prophet, but a living power. That's what I, as an evangelical, believe. That we are a storehouse of living power that is not limited to church, but that we can see at work in the common good. So, brothers and sisters, how will we choose this week? What stories will drive our awareness? What images and words will live in our consciousness? What small acts will we take in the direction that we believe is shalom? This is our opportunity. We've been sent a prayer from Central District Conference, Missional Church Committee, that prays our intent to do so in our context. It is in your bulletin. I've made it very few changes that are in italics. But our brothers and sisters are joining us in this prayer and this intention. Join me in the bold words. O Holy One, you have created one human family of all persons of the earth in all its diversity. But we live in a world of injustice, fear, abuse of power, and racism. We find ourselves denying others their humanity in subtle, apathetic, spoken, unspoken, and sometimes violent ways. We confess that we are too often full of despair and grow numb to suffering. We turn our backs to the brokenness of the world. We confess that we feel too disconnected, too unimportant, too ill-equipped, or too tired to live out the justice-filled healing and hope our faith requires. Wake us up, O Holy One. Comfort those of us who are grieving. Disturb those of us who are complacent. Breathe fire into our hearts and new life into our imaginations. May we see the world through the eyes of Jesus, and in seeing act compassionately together to reveal good news and abundant life. Amen.
We ask God to bless these gifts and to bless those who have given them this morning.
This is our time for sharing your thoughts on the meditation today. What things come into your mind? What were you struck by? And then we'll move into also sharing joys and concerns.
I heard such a good story on the radio this morning, which fit right together with Nina's message. It was called Cops and Barbers, about this black barber in Charlotte and his friend, a policeman, and how they are trying to get together and heal their community a little bit at a time by letting the cops know the community. It was just so inspiring.
Some good news.
Maybe you don't remember whether I've said anything about it before, but my son Tim works with a company in South Bend called Mennonite, and they are about providing software to help large cities and smaller cities work on how to handle the combination of stormwater and sewage. And they are basically interested in cleaning up the environment. Cities who dump raw sewage into waterways, whether rivers or lakes or whatever, are fined on the basis of so much per gallon. And the whole point of that fine is to get cities to, stop paying the big bills to the government or for, in the way of fines. And the program that MNET does is to help the cities refine and use better logic in how to deal with the infrastructure that they already have, and use it as sort of a banking system that places, the downtown South Bend, for instance, needs a quicker way to get rid of that combination of things. When heavy storms hit, it washes all the bird poop and everything off and whatever, and that all ends up in in the drainage system. And they'll pay a higher price, for instance, to get rid of that. If you think of it as a banking system, they have to invest in how do we get rid of this. So, I mean, using that metaphor, it's a lot more complicated than what I'm sharing with you today. The point that I'm making is that maybe Tim has sort of turned his back on Jerusalem, but he has not turned his back on the common good. And I see that there's something beyond my ability to comprehend it all. And I just, as the boys were talking back and forth last night, Joe and Tim, Joe's on a different wave. He's getting motorhomes, trucks and buses delivered around the country, works for a company in Wakarusa. But his interests are way beyond that. He and his wife study things like photons coming out of stars from billions of light years away. And when you get into discussions at that level, you think, these guys have way surpassed their dad. So I guess to some degree, I've done my job as a father, and to help my sons become bigger and greater and heavier thinker, deeper thinkers than whatever I could imagine. And it all started with simple stories like we're driving around Indianapolis and we had a green Chevelle station wagon, which we call the green cucumber. And of course, as we're going around the city, I turned it into a racetrack, and I started making commentary as I'm going, and now the green cucumbers pulling up on that white Dodge over there or whatever. And, yeah, we're going to pass them. And the boys, yeah, go get them, Dad, go get them. And then running math through their minds as we drive along as well. So some things have come together that in some ways I'm not pleased with it, but other ways I'm really impressed. And I'm glad there's something going for the common good.
Other thoughts and comments? I was struck in reading the scripture, and maybe this is because the issue of sexism has really come to my mind lately in treatment of women. But here's the Bible saying, take a wife, give a daughter, like it's property. And, so attitudes go way, way back and shape the way we think, unfortunately, some people. So that struck me. And Nina, your thought about being energy efficient made me think of the 30 or 40 that gather in this building that is hard to heat and not energy efficient. And, that's something that we all should think about too, I suppose. At least I feel that way. Any other comments on the theme and topic for today, or joys and concerns?
The scripture today spoke to me about these huge problems of tribalism and nationalism. The Jews had identified Jerusalem as the chosen, the promised land, and they had to suffer this enormous disillusionment in being exiled. But the problems of nationalism and tribalism are very alive today. Look at the issue in Syria. That's really in part a tribal conflict that doesn't get a lot of news, but that's what makes it so intractable. Look at other areas in the Middle East, the same thing. And when people